I'm not sure if you've heard of this term, but it's becoming more integrated in the grieving journey, and that is called grief integration. I had heard quite a bit about it as I was going through my own grief education pathway, but I hadn't really heard much about it until really the last couple of months. So what is grief integration? It's the premise that we acknowledge that our grief is going to be with us for the rest of our lives, and we learn to navigate with it. Now, some may say, well, Allison, if my grief is going to be with me my whole life, like what's the point of a grieving journey or healing if I know that it's always going to be with me? Well, grief isn't something to get rid of. Grief actually becomes a part of our life. Here's a great example. The first 6 months to a year after my dad died, I was about the business of doing the things. So I felt sad. I was grieving that my dad wasn't there, but I hadn't really hit in the reality in my brain that my person was no longer here in this physical realm. About a year or two later, that year to 3 month mark, it was really difficult. And it was almost so overwhelming that it was hard to navigate the day to day. And then about year 2 to 4 in there was some noticing in the midst of the times when it felt overwhelming, and that overwhelming wave started to decline. And I started to notice that there were moments where I didn't think about my grief. I knew if I thought about my grief, it would be there, but it wasn't in the forefront of my mind. And so what was the difference? The difference was the integration. The integration was actually learning about my grief, why I felt grief, how I felt grief, where I felt grief, and actually acknowledge that grief existed instead of trying to resist it or forget it or I should do certain things. My grief became my own story, my own way, my own path. Then the integration started to shift towards how do I make grief something that is just as precious as when I feel joy, or as I feel when I'm in the flow. Grief became a motivator. Grief became a inspiration. Grief became part of a story versus it being the story. I'm now 6 years now, just 6 years past of my dad's death anniversary. And there are moments when I feel the grief wave, and I now have time where I can be with that grief wave and give myself the permission, even when it's inconvenient, to just be in that grief wave. The other day, my husband and I were coming back from a trip, and we were driving through the small downtown of Bentonville, Arkansas. And there is a funeral home that also does like the cremation and the embalming and all of that. And we drove by there, and I hadn't driven by that particular spot of downtown Bentonville for many years. And when I did, I didn't really have my eyes on that this is where I was at. And we drove by that place, and the wave of grief overtook me. Yet instead of staying in the bucket of hell with it, I was at the top of the pail. I still felt it, I still saw it, I still knew why I was feeling the grief, because we went by that house. That's the funeral home, and I had the memory of me walking up the stairs, accepting my dad's ashes, talking with the funeral director, going back to my car and just sitting in the car with the urn of my dad's ashes. And then I remembered, instead of staying there in that car, I remembered the next moment, and then the next moment of taking his ashes and going to the gravesite and sharing it with his sister, and having her take the ashes and put them in the ground. And then it fast forward through a movie of other things, and that's the integration. So even though I still have the waves of grief, I still have the moments of this is hard, there are now the moments that I can acknowledge, embrace, and honor the grief that I had. And there are days when I don't even think about it at all, and I will look back to the end of the week and go, oh wow, I noticed that I didn't think about it at all. It didn't mean I forgot my loved one. It didn't mean that I forgot the love that I have for my loved one. And this takes time. And I know when you're at the beginning of this journey, it can feel like that's impossible. And it is in that moment. And that's okay.